Okay, so I left you guys on a bit of a cliffhanger in the last video, so I'm gonna make up for that here, right? So what ended up happening is once Ultron arrives on the scene, a fight immediately breaks out between him and Adam Warlock. Now, this is something that you don't usually see, and that's one of the things to know. For those of you guys who are new to Marvel Comics, Marvel, for the most part, kind of keep things contained in-house, and it's something that people aren't necessarily fans of, but oftentimes what you will see when it comes to various groups facing off against various villains is they sort of keep it to themselves. Now, a lot of that's just the nature of the comics. In a Spider-Man comic, for example, you don't really see him fighting a villain of Captain America. You wouldn't really see him fighting Red Skull because Spider-Man largely has his own villains to fight. Now, that's kind of the downside of comics because somebody takes over the run of Spider-Man and it's like, well, here we go. Peter Parker's gonna fight the Green Goblin again for like the 1 millionth time. And it does kind of get boring after a while, and Marvel tries to solve that issue with crossovers, which I think is the wrong way to approach it. But the fact remains that you don't usually see Ultron facing off against Adam Warlock. And what you're talking about here is a version of Ultron that's just as strong as he ever was, facing off against a guy that he's never fought before, but is well aware of. And that's kind of a cool thing because, again, when it comes to these different superheroes, while you may not necessarily see them fight villains that don't traditionally belong to them, these villains are aware of who they are. And when it comes to Adam Warlock, his significance exists on a universal level. Everybody in the universe knows who Adam Warlock is, at least if they've been around for a little while. Again, that's the reason why Phylla-Vell doesn't really know, because she hasn't been here all that long. But given the cosmic power of Adam Warlock, even if he doesn't have total control over it, he is able to hold his own against the Phalanx to a degree, but he's not able to hold them off permanently. And that's an important thing to grasp here, is because a lot of people who are fans of Adam Warlock would be like, no, Adam Warlock would absolutely destroy the Phalanx with very little effort. And under normal circumstances, you would be right. If we're talking about Adam Warlock during the events of like the Infinity Gauntlet, or Adam Warlock during Infinity War, or Infinity Crusade, or you're talking about him in any of the other stories that are written out there, yeah, I mean, he would win this blindfolded. But one of the things to remember is this is Adam Warlock freshly back, right? So his powers haven't fully coalesced, but at the same time, he doesn't fully know who he is or what he's capable of. So it's not Adam Warlock at 100%. And so him going against a Phalanx and being able to kind of hold his own, but also struggling, is one, a testament to the power of the Phalanx, but two, also shows how weakened Adam Warlock is in this situation. And so what ends up happening here is when he does go against Ultron, Ultron does get the upper hand on him. Now, you do have Phylla-Vell with Moondragon trying to race her out of there as fast as they can, but ultimately she ends up perishing. And so beseeching the High Evolutionary and just being like, we have to find a way out of here. Like, we have to get out of here as fast as we can. At the end of the day, it's all they really can do. Adam Warlock kind of keeps going through these energy fluxes, right, where he has these sort of energy-based epileptic seizures, if you want to call them that, and where Phylla-Vell does show up. This is one of the most badass moments for a character, right? This is one of the reasons why I tell people Phylla-Vell is someone who's slept on, and when the time comes where she gets put in the MCU, like, she's gonna blow the doors off, right? You haven't seen anything from anybody in the MCU when it comes to like hand-to-hand conflict. Wanda, Spectrum, Monica Rambeau, Captain America, none of those guys have anything on Phylla-Vell, because when she comes in here, she starts taking it to the Phalanx and literally just hacking them to pieces. But here's the downside to this. While she is just super amped up and she is able to hold her own, Adam Warlock communicates with the High Evolutionary, and the High Evolutionary tells him Phylla-Vell can buy us time, but the reality here is she's fighting bloodlusted. She's not fighting intelligently. She's not fighting cleanly. She's fighting emotionally. And as a result of that, she's going to make a mistake. And when that happens, that will give Ultron and the Phalanx the one opening they need to get the upper hand on her and to either kill her or capture her and turn her into a select. The only option we have here is to get out as fast as we can. But what the High Evolutionary reveals is that as kind of a safety measure, what he had done was basically build a bomb inside of a sun, inside of the local star. And when that happens, he basically ends up detonating it, and it literally destroys the entire sun along with the whole star system. Now, it does give High Evolutionary and those guys the chance to get out of there, but it destroys all the existing Phalanx in that area along with Ultron. Now, that's not the last time we're going to see him. Don't worry, Ultron didn't go out with the death of a star. It would be the least interesting ending to Ultron ever, so don't worry, it's not the last time we see him. But what we end up doing here is switching over to Ronan the Accuser and basically Ravenous. Now, Ravenous is the one who leads the forces of the Annihilation Wave. To offer a little more explanation here, because I know I was a little scant on providing information to you guys over the course of like everything that was going on. So when Annihilus made his invasion of the main Marvel universe during Annihilation, one of the things that happened here is he tasked Ravenous with tracking down those individuals that had the ability to tap into the power cosmic, Galactus, Silver Surfer, and those guys. The nature of the Annihilation Wave was not just a giant giant army of bugs. I mean, it was to a degree, but you basically had generals, right? Those individuals who were more powerful than this army of a trillion bugs. They could basically lead them, carry out their orders, different things like that. But Ravenous was powerful enough to overcome the Silver Surfer and Galactus. So this guy's no small threat. Now, one thing to understand, he did have the entire backing of the Annihilation Wave at his disposal. So that's one of the ways in which he was able to get it done. But the truth about this is that Ronan the Accuser showing up here is done for a very particular reason, because when he arrives, it's actually to gain access to the Citadel, not even to really make a deal with Ravenous. He simply says he's there to do that, right? He literally lies his ass off. He's like, oh, I'm here to broker a deal. I'm here for us to kind of join forces, create a coalition, and to basically find a way to tear down the Phalanx. But the reality here is that Ravenous and the Annihilation Wave have no respect for the Kree, and if they had it their way, they would eradicate the entirety of the Kree. What you have here is kind of a stalemate. You have basically the entire Kree race, led by the Supreme Intelligence, which are ridiculously powerful, standing against Ravenous and what's left of the Annihilation Wave. If the Annihilation Wave decided to attack the Kree, it would basically lead to the destruction of both races, right? Vice versa. If the Kree decided to attack the Annihilation Wave, they would basically end up getting annihilated, right? It would destroy all of their forces. And so where you initially have Ravenous, who's like, there will be no truce, and initially goes against and tries to find a way to destroy Ronan the Accuser, you basically end up having Wraith that makes his move. Now, Wraith is a character that we really haven't talked about too much in Marvel Comics, and a lot of that's because he's very much a fringe character. He does have his origins that kind of predate the events of Annihilation and Annihilation Conquest, but this is the first time when you really see any meaningful appearance of his character. The reality here is he's not that important to the overall Marvel landscape, and he's really not even important to Annihilation Conquest. He's only really important in this moment, but he is immensely powerful. So when it comes to Wraith, the idea behind his character is that he is a guy, or at least was a Kree, who as a child was sucked into a kind of wormhole after his family was slaughtered, and basically encountered a group called the Nameless. Now, the Nameless, as they were presented to us by Dan Abnett, were basically Kree who were sucked into the wormhole as well, but he ended up having these kind of parasites that basically infected his body, and they operate something akin to the Venom symbiote, right, where they're not that dissimilar. The overall gist behind this is that because of the parasites, the Exelon, that basically infect him, the way this works is, one, he's got a healing factor that rivals Deadpool, and depending on the story, actually expands beyond it, right? Like, his healing factor is insane. He can heal from virtually anything instantaneously. As long as a being is not of sufficient power to eradicate him on the spot, he can survive from virtually any sort of damage. But the Exelon themselves, or these parasites, also provide kind of the ability to metamorph, right? So in the same way that like Carnage as a symbiote can turn his arms into like axes and things like that, that Wraith can more or less do the same thing. But because of these parasites within him, he is by all standards of measurement immortal, right? Again, so long as some being out there of sufficient power can't destroy him, then he'll never really be destroyed. The reality is that in this moment in time, the only reason why he matters, and really the only reason why we're even talking about him, is because using his capabilities, he basically subdues Ravenous. And they kind of, it's the equivalent of having like a gun at his head, right? Like, anybody do anything and we shoot. That's really kind of how it is. But what it does is it keeps the forces of the Annihilation Wave at bay, and it allows Ronan the Accuser to access the quote-unquote weapon of the Kree, the ultimate weapon of the Kree. We'll find out exactly what that is at a future point in time, but what we end up doing here is basically switching over to the Guardians of the Galaxy. Right now, again, like we talked about in the last video, they're not technically the Guardians, but they more or less are. The team is forming over the course of this story, right? Like Dan Abnett's like, here's a bunch of guys who were banded together for a singular cause. Some of them are gonna make it, and the ones who are left, they're gonna become the Guardians of the Galaxy. That's basically how this is working right now. Again, their goal is to plant bombs throughout the entirety of the Babel Spire in order to detonate it, but in the midst of all this, they're met by the arrival of Blastar, who is basically turned into one of the select of the Phalanx because of how powerful he is, along with Ultron himself. Now, of course, basically Blastar kills some of the members who don't quite make it to become Guardians of the Galaxy, and Peter Quill is ultimately subdued and met by the arrival of Ultron. So, of course, while the rest of the members are able to make their escape, Peter's taken prisoner. Inevitably, he's going to experience torture here. Now, this is where we would normally end the video, and we would end it in some super amped up way, making up for the fact that I left you guys on a massive cliffhanger in the last video. What we end up doing here is picking up with Ultron as really you kind of have the torturing process going on with Peter Quill. Now, Ultron's initial response here to these guys, right, to the Phalanx who are taking it to Peter, is, why are you physically torturing him? We need what's in his head. We don't need what's in his body, right? We don't need that to happen. And so the result of this is Ultron tries to use the power of the Phalanx, basically technological telepathy, to read the mind and to scan the mind of Peter Quill. Now, the benefit to this is that Mantis is actually keeping the mind of Peter protected, so that Ultron can't read the mind of Peter and learn anything about the the insurgency that's taking place on the Kree planet Hala, as well as what the ultimate plans are for the planet itself, right, for the Babel Spire. And so Peter Quill, just kind of undergoing this form of torture, Ultron comes to this realization that because of the fact that he can't read the mind of Peter Quill, that instead he is going to have to physically break him, right? He's going to have to just inflict such horrors on him that Peter Quill is going to really have no choice but to relent, if for no other reason than to make the pain stop. And so what this does is this jumps back to Adam Warlock, Phylla-Vell, and the High Evolutionary. Now, Adam Warlock, again, because of the nature of his cosmic powers and so on, is able to perform or create a kind of sphere that himself and High Evolutionary and Phylla-Vell are able to escape in. But again, his powers are a little kind of finicky here, right? They're not working perfectly. So while it is seemingly enough to allow them to basically transport, the reality here is that Adam Warlock's powers are constantly in a state of flux. And so what this means is that as they approach the planet Hala, that ultimately his powers flake out. And when that happens, they're just barely able to make it to Hala itself. Now, jumping back to Ronan the Accuser, the revelation that he provides here in terms of the source of power that the Kree have is basically their sentries. Now, this is kind of a crazy thing, and initially it seems kind of dumb, and Ravenous even calls it right off the bat, because if you guys remember, at the beginning of Annihilation Conquest, the first thing to be taken over by the Phalanx were the sentries of the Kree. Now, for those of you guys who aren't familiar with this, the Kree sentries are basically just these giant robots that the Kree makes to carry out their own campaigns. It's one of the reasons why the Kree have been such a formidable force throughout the entirety of the universe, because over the years, and when I say years, I mean like the millions of years that their race has been around, if not potentially billions, that what you have were them developing sentries, which were these supremely powerful robots that would normally go in and either accompany Kree soldiers or just fight the battle in Kree soldiers' stead, right? So that the Kree don't have to worry about losing their own. But the sentries were immensely powerful. In Marvel Comics, when the sentries first popped up, they were overpowering Earth superheroes. So that's kind of how these things exist. They're exceedingly capable. But Ravenous calls it right off the bat, and is like, this is your grand plan, right? Like literally, the sentries were the first thing the Phalanx took over. The robots. You're gonna send an army of robots against an army that can take over robots. This is your grand plan. If you're not the dumbest person that I've ever met in my entire life, then I don't know what you are, right? And that's when Ronan makes his revelation and saying, no, these are Kree sentries, sure, and they are robots. The difference here is that I brought a woman with me, Faxagora, right? This girl can shield these robots from the influence of the Phalanx. We can literally send these immensely powerful robots in, and the Phalanx will never be able to take them over. The Phalanx will never be able to conquer them. So long as we maintain that control, we now have an expansion to our army. Now, one thing I want to make you guys aware of, any one of these sentries is more than enough for the forces of Ravenous and his Annihilation Wave. And so at this point, we jump back to Adam Warlock and we jump back to Phylla-Vell. Now, again, one of the things that had happened here is the High Evolutionary had basically stated that at the request of the Supreme Intelligence, he had devised a way to create perfect Kree, right? And to essentially take these new Kree, essentially turn them into kind of empty vessels, if you want to call them that, and take the consciousness of an existing Kree and put them into the body of a new Kree, right? Literally bioengineer beings of immense power. So it's like if I created a version of you that could bench press 2,000 pounds, but that version of you had no consciousness, and then I could take your brain and put it in the body of that version of yourself that can now bench press 2,000 pounds. That's what we're talking about here, right? Like a transference of consciousness. And this in turn would allow the Kree to expand its capabilities and to move on. What the High Evolutionary reveals here to Adam Warlock and to Phylla-Vell is it did exactly that. The Supreme Intelligence followed the instructions of the High Evolutionary down to a T. Before its presumed destruction during Annihilation, that it followed everything exactly as it was supposed to. What Phylla-Vell and Adam Warlock are looking at here in this giant hallway full of all these vessels are these new Kree bodies that are just waiting to be inhabited. But ultimately, in the midst of this conversation, the Phalanx emerge. But when Adam Warlock asked the question, High Evolutionary, why are those guys here? The response of the High Evolutionary is, yeah, about them, they got here first and they made me an offer. I'm sorry, Adam Warlock. And the High Evolutionary turns against Adam Warlock and sides with Ultron and the Phalanx. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Another cliffhanger, right? Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.